Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
The Lost Brother by Psychotic Tomato. What if Luffy was trained harder by Garp and unlocked all 3 types of haki? What if because of that, Ace lives? What if Big Mom was better? What if Big Mom had a child kidnapped from her and the family? What if Luffy was said child? Adios.
Chapter 15 Luffy along with his siblings who couldn't handle the sight of torture or gore were escorted into the waiting room located inside the ship. The siblings who would be giving retribution upon Porkami emphasize about how violent and brutal the payback would be for the man who dared tortured one of their brothers. Luffy went with his weaker-hearted siblings because they didn't want him to have any bad memories surface if he kept being around the bastard Porkami. Although they were considering giving him the honors to finish off the bastard for good once they were done with him hanging by a thread of his life. Considering the fact that Luffy was tortured at such a very young age, he was guaranteed to have gained heavy trauma, and his piece of shit grandfather probably never thought of giving him therapy if the man even knew about the events that transpired. Hell, he probably added or made the trauma even stronger for him, even if he knew about what had happened or not. But they were based on assumptions from what they have gathered about the marine hero so far. He was with his siblings who were either younger than him or around his age, Ewan, along with Panna, Chiffon, Bavarua, Basans, Moscato and Opera. The decuplets had left and came back with boxes of toys for their siblings who were still children and several snacks and drinks to keep the older siblings occupied. The 29 Charlottes including Luffy were chilling inside with the very young siblings playing around while the others were relaxing and conversing on either sofas or beanie bags. "Luffy, is that guy really the same man who tortured you back in Fuchsia?" Panna asked with her ungloved hand on his shoulder, looking at him worried. She took off her animal claw gloves as soon as they stepped inside the waiting room and put them somewhere her child siblings wouldn't be able to reach. The claws were very sharp after all. She would always attempt to cheer her siblings up if they seemed down about something. The siblings sitting down also shot a look of concern towards their older brother. Some of the children who were smart and mature for their age also looked at Luffy worried for their older brother. Luffy nodded towards her. "Yay. I can't forget his face and his tattoos," he said before looking up at the ceiling, remembering how painful it was. How lonely it was. Noticing how he was drifting off into memories, she squeezed his shoulders to pull him back to reality, which worked. He shot a bright smile at his older sister for that, Panna giving her own smile in return. Bavarua with his gloves laying on the table in front of the sofa leaned back, thinking about Porkami. How did someone like him end up in the New World? An organ harvesting organization also to boot. At that the siblings also were wondering. A pirate from around paradise going to the New World was a rarity, considering how they needed to either be very strong with a minimum of a 100 million berry on their head or needed to be part of a crew with the captain meeting set requirements. Knowing how inhumane harvesters started off in the New World, the chances and possibilities for Porkami to get here was slim to none unless he sailed with another strong group before later joining them. Maybe they had a group they branched into paradise to recruit weak pirates to use as cannon fodder? Basans gave the most likely and reasonable answer towards the discussion. At that the siblings nodded slightly in approval, hearing his theory. It seemed like the most plausible theory so far. Maybe they will get their answer when their other siblings were done giving retribution to the man. Hopefully that bastard gets what is coming for him, Pudding said, crossing her arms with a scowl on her face. She didn't like how one of her siblings were tortured, especially when it was her most kindest and supportive older brother. Even though he was with them for less than a week, he had already left a hell on an impression on not only her but for a handful of her siblings also. His presence felt like a third son, the second being Prometheus and the first being the normal son. He was warm, embracing and kind. He could light up anyone's mood when they were around him. For her brother to suffer like that, knowing our big brothers and sisters, they probably would give him hell, Flamp commented, which was true. They were quite a close-knit family and were protective of one another. Doesn't matter how close they were to certain siblings, they will give hell to whoever hurts one of them. But this was a first time in the family, where one of their siblings wasn't wounded or insulted, but tortured. Porkami was about to experience pain beyond imaginable. The siblings all nodded at Flampe's words and decided to use this time to get along and know more about their brother. Anyway, Luffy, do you remember our names? Moscato asked Luffy while motioning towards the Charlottes gathered in this one room. He seriously doubted he remembered all 85 of them. Only Pudding, Flamp and Chiffon. He responded bluntly, to which he nodded in understanding. There were 85 of them including himself, and Luffy was unfortunately raised outside the family, so he knows little about them. Of course it would be hard to remember them. Well, let's formally introduce ourselves, Moscato said, clapping his hands, changing his expression to a cheerful one. I am Moscato, your older brother, he said while putting a hand on his chest to emphasize his identity, which Luffy nodded in response. Basans, the man with several antlers on his head, waved lazily at Luffy while leaning into a beanbag chair. Opera Fa, the cream man said cheerfully. Bavarua, he said, crossing his arms and puffing his chest. Panna, your big sis, the young woman who was sitting next to Luffy said cheerfully towards his younger brother. Nougat, the 42nd son of Big Mom, announced. He was wearing a white feathery scarf around his mouth to cover what is ever underneath the scarf, similar to Katakuri. I am Nuichi, and these are Nuji, Nuzan, Nushi, Nugo, Nutmeg, Akameg, Almeg, Harumeg and Fuyumeg. We are the Charlotte decuplets. We were 10 children born from mama in a single birth. Nuichi with his green hat announced his decuplet siblings' names on their behalf while pointing at each one, the only surefire to tell which one was who were. For the brothers, their hats which had different colors, and Nushi standing out due to his very different build. For the sisters, who were way easier to tell apart, their different hairstyles with different colored ribbons on their necks. I'm Ewan. I'm around your age, by the way, he said with a smile on his face. He wanted to know more about his brother, who was around the same age as him, and hear about his accomplishments throughout his life. Luffy just hummed in acknowledgement, knowing their names. You know, now that I think about it, what was that guy's bounty? Ewan asked Luffy after introducing himself towards him. What guy? That right-hand man guy? Luffy asked, not knowing who Ewan was specifically talking about. Ewan nodded to confirm who he was talking about. Yeah, that guy. I'm pretty sure it's around 510,430,000 berries, Moscato said after digging through his memories. Since inhumane harvesters were the most likely suspect for the continuous attacks on Toto Land, they dug through that specific group the most to learn more about them. They could be considered a group that met the New World's standard in terms of strength, but they could definitely handle them. Eh? His bounty was that high? I thought it was lower, Flamp exclaimed in disbelief over this. She never really researched much about the organ harvesters. That weakling was worth 100 million berries less than Snack. Even though he got his ass handed to him with their brother Luffy clearly not going all out, his bounty was still that high? Luffy at this rubbed his head, remembering Shaki's words about Jaggy's bounties. Shaki said something about bounties being higher if you kill civilians, out loud, trailing off to remember more of the conversation. Moscato nodded at this before educating his siblings about how the system works. The bounties are issued by the world government through the Marines. They are based on how much they view an individual as a threat. The process is ran in the Marines' main base of operation, where they determine the threat by how high their bounties should be before publishing them, so people would know the person is a criminal. Moscato took a breather before explaining further. His bounty was that high because his group targeted people regardless of gender or age and what they would do to said people, which made the government deem them more of a threat than people who are stronger than them, thus a higher bounty is given. Take our sibling's bounty, especially Katakuri Ni-san for example. He could go toe-to-toe with either king or queen from Kaido's crew. But, his bounty is 300 million berries less than those two, right? At that the siblings nodded while some shocked glances at Luffy. Katakuri was higher than their rubber brother's bounty by just 57 million berries. That's because we mostly just deal with anyone trying to attack our home, or when Mama orders us to invade islands, which is quite rare nowadays. She mostly sticks to diplomatic negotiations so she could come to an agreement with the island's inhabitants so she could trade certain resources that are exclusive over there. But Kaido's crew is a different case. He rules over Wano and has plans to go against the world government. If I remember correctly from Mama's network of spies, something called Smiles were involved with his plans on dealing with the government forces. Moscato finished trailing off. He couldn't exactly remember what Kaido's plan with Smiles entailed, but it would definitely make him even more of a threat than them because they just invaded islands and dealt with intruders but never truly opposed the government. Kaido on the other hand was building an army where he would attack them with said army. The only reason they know this was because Mama had set up a network of spies which were from her crew that had no bounties or infamous backgrounds, making them easy for them to sneak into places as a mole, either into the ranks of Marines or the ranks of pirates. Especially other Yonkos. She was still working on sending spies towards the revolutionaries to hopefully pick up her son's whereabouts, but since Luffy was with them now, she could care less about what they did. Huh, the more you know, Nougat said, showing interest over this topic along with his siblings who were unaware about it, while the older and knowledgeable ones nodded at Moscato's lesson. He remembered what Mont d'Or taught them. Even though Mont d'Or was 3 years younger than Moscato, he was the smartest of the family, with the second smartest being Perospero. They were happily chatting until a scream of a man was heard above them and their faces turned solemn. They knew who was screaming. It seems they have started, a few minutes ago, on the deck. Porkami was lying down unconscious before he felt a sharp pain in his sides. He groaned and stirred awake, opening his eyes looking at the ground. He had a severe headache and was trying to recollect the past events that had happened. They were attacking Big Mom's island before they got decimated by her children. He widened his eyes and gulped when he realized his situation. He was still on board. Feeling the cool breeze on his back, he knew exactly where he was. He was on the deck, out in the open. Finally, you are awake. Porkami heard an unfamiliar voice from his right side. He hesitantly looked up in front of him. He wished he hadn't. In front of him were several of Big Mom's children, most notably being a tall woman with white hair with one-eyed cover, a tall man with a scar covering his mouth, a man with a candy staff with a giant tongue, and a big woman who had a hat that what seemed to contain an assortment of fruits. All were glaring down at the man with deep hatred and fury. He was confused before that feeling turned fearful. Did he do something to piss of the Charlottes on a personal level? He wanted to ask, but he was too overwhelmed with fear to the point he couldn't speak. He was afraid to mutter a single word. But even in fear he could still observe his surroundings, and oh boy, he wished he didn't. It seemed like 60 or 50 of the Charlotte family had surrounded the man, all with equally pissed off and savage expressions on their faces, which made Porkami feel very small. Like several sea kings surrounding a sheep, it was silence before. "Are you Porkami?" A female voice echoed with clear bloodlust mixed in her tone. Looking at where the voice came from, he turned his head and faced straight forward. He saw 2 giant feet, which caused him to pale at the fact that the woman must have been gigantic if her legs were that big. Looking up caused him to pale further when he saw the woman's disturbingly sinister Cheshire grin. At that moment, Porkami knew that no matter what he does or say, he was getting out of here dead. He was frozen in fear while still keeping eye contact with the giant, afraid to blink as if she would slaughter him if he broke eye contact for even a split second. After a couple of seconds of silence, the woman slowly lost her grin and was replaced with a frown. She leaned forward, asking again slowly but with more strength in each words now. "Are you Porkami?" Porkami shook his head up and down, afraid he would displease her and be killed by her if he didn't respond this time. At that, the woman's mood didn't seem to lighten. It seemed like her aura just got heavier and more violent. Porkami broke eye contact with her and looked at her children instead, only to be greeted with another sight of raised bloodlust and anger. In fact, most of them had an even more bloodthirsty and hateful expression that was directed at Porkami. Porkami, confused, frightened and pale from his situation, decided he really needed to ask. Why are you all looking at me like that?" He shouted out loud. If he was going to die, he at least wanted to know why. Instead of answers, they only asked him more questions. "Do you know who this is? This time?" the tall man with a scarf asked, raising his left hand to show the bounty poster he was holding while the other hand now had a trident in it. In fact, it seemed all the children started unsheathing their weapon of choice right after their older brother took his out, but Porkami hadn't picked this up yet. Porkami, upon seeing who it was, gulped. "Monkey D. Luffy. Wanted dead or alive? 1 billion berries?" He was shocked and flabbergasted over seeing that brat's face again and his bounty that he wasn't aware of. He knew he was going to get a decent bounty, but this high? Judging by your expression, I take it you know him." Smoothie now stepped forward, looking down at him. He nodded at her. "Yeah. What about it? Yeah, sure, he's got a high bounty and all that now, but what does that have to do with all of this? Did you torture him?" Porkami looked behind and saw a woman with a panda mask and shark-like teeth eyeing at him like a prey. Porkami visibly recoiled, looking at the woman's terrifying display of teeth, which caused her eyes to narrow in what seemed like anger by his reaction. He didn't respond, which got the woman to slowly walk towards him in a way that made him feel chills going his spine with each step she took. She was now 2 feet apart from the man before she asked again. "Did you torture him?" Porkami thought about his response. Clearly Luffy was someone important towards the Charlottes, much to his misfortune with what he did to said brat. And with each truth he tells, they were more pissed by him. He wanted to lie about what he did to him, but if he did, they would probably catch on to the lie and give him an even more painful death. Essentially his options were to either die painfully or die more painfully. So he went option and went with yes. Sadly, this triggered the third option. The most painful and slowest death. Warning, gore ahead. It's safe when you see gore and or something between the next line break. Porkami nodded towards her. "Yeah, brat had it coming though, you see." Before Porkami continued, Poir clasped his hands and now had a cheerful expression on her face. Thank God. Porkami was confused by her words before. Munch, he felt something wet on his pinky finger, only to find it missing. Porkami was stunned before he screamed in agony when the pain started coming in. He pulled his hand away from her grasp while applying pressure on his missing pinky finger, looking forward at Poir. He found his pinky between her teeth in her mouth, which were stretched into a bloody grin. She spitted it out and faced him with the same cheerful expression, clapped her hands satisfied over Porkami's response. Thank God, that we can give you our utmost, sincerest, purest feelings of hatred and fury for what you did. She singed out with her tone sounding like she had fallen down towards the deepest depths of insanity and embraced it, which matched her now psychotic grin. It wasn't only Poir who was grinning like a maniac. All of the Charlottes seemed overjoyed over his response. Payback was long overdue for him after all. Porkami was shaking his hand over the fact he now had 4 fingers on it. He could still feel his pinky finger, which was reduced to a phantom limb now. Looking forward, he finally asked the million-dollar question. Why is that brat so important to you? Oven stepped up with a scowl on his face while cracking his knuckles. That brat we keep talking about. Porkami was sweating very heavily when the atmosphere suddenly felt extremely warm. Our brother, Katakuri, responded behind him with a raised trident before he slashed his back, causing the man to yell again. But even with the fresh wound on his back, Porkami was more in shock than pain for a split moment as he processed this. He now realized his fate. He had tortured Luffy. He had tortured their little brother. Porkami wanted to beg for his life. He really did. But the only sounds he could muster out were screams and wailings of pain, which were music to the Charlotte's ears. Normally I would give people the option of what organs I would pluck out of them if they harmed my siblings. Katakuri trailed off before getting rid of his trident. He didn't want to kill him on accident. But for you who tortured my baby brother, he kneeled down before proceeding to grab harshly onto the left side of his face with his thumb pointed at his eye. You don't have that much freedom, Katakuri said with his voice raised before pushing his thumb into his left eye, causing the man to struggle out of his grasp in pain. After a while, Katakuri let go of him and threw him onto his stomach with bits of what was left of Porkami's eye on his gloves. Porkami was beyond scared with all the events that suddenly transpired. He needed to get the fuck out of there now. But before he could get up, Oven stepped onto his left leg, which burned due to his devil fruit. Where do you think you are going? Oven asked mockingly while pressing his leg deeper into the mont's own leg and raising the temperature higher. He was putting all of his anger and frustration for what he did to their baby brother with his foot. Porkami wailed in pain and tried to wiggle his way out, which, after a few seconds, it worked. He now needed to stand up and run, but he fell instead, and actually, he now couldn't feel anything on his left leg. Looking back, he found the reason why. Oven was looking at him with a cruel smirk on his face. The tall man stepped back before picking up his left leg. Oven had burned through several pieces of his flesh, so when Porkami was wiggling, He tore his own leg off, much to the mont's delight and amusement, seeing him trying to stand up but failing miserably. Parasparrow stepped forward. Leaning forward before the newly amputated man, he examined his state before scoffing. Not enough, Paroin, the eldest, concluded. He hadn't suffered enough for what he did to Luffy. Porkamy grabbed onto Parasparrow's leg, clinging onto him like he was life support while crying heavily. "Please, mercy," the elder brother scoffed before angrily asking, "If you are asking for mercy, Paroin, then did you show our brother any?" Porkamy squealed at how he raised his voice, letting go of his leg and just looking up at the man without responding. He couldn't reply and could only stare at him with his remaining eye. Parasparrow relaxed his gaze. "Exactly, Paroin," before he stabbed his other eye with his candy staff and pulling out his eye impaled on his staff. "There shall be no mercy, atone for what you did to our brother." Porkamy was now permanently blinded with the loss of his eyes. His tears were now blood-stained with the amount of blood gushing out of the now empty eye sockets, with only bits of what's left of his eyes inside. He has lost his sight. Porkamy was crawling around screaming frantically for help before Paro's knee. "Go for it." He felt something sticky on both of his hand and remaining leg, which halted his movement. He tried to wiggle out of it, but "Slow ballad," Porkamy screamed. Out of all the punishments the Charlottes dished out, whoever this woman was had to be the worst of them all so far. She was slowly cutting away his remaining leg off. And to add more insult to injury, Smoothie and Snack had struck their swords onto his arms just as a man finished cutting his leg off. In that moment he now had lost all of his limbs. He has lost the ability to move. He wanted to scream more, but he had screamed so much, the only thing he could do was whimper or let out sounds of groaning. He felt someone grabbing onto his hair before he felt all of his teeth broken after a hard hit which was delivered towards his mouth. But before he could even process this, the mysterious man had grabbed his tongue and sliced it off. Cracker grinned, satisfied over what he did with his sword and a fist coated in haki. He has lost the ability to speak. Gore end. Gore end. Gore end. "I warned you." Be glad this was mild. Laughing face Porkamy, once a proud pirate, was reduced to a useless pile of flesh not even worth acknowledging. He kept wiggling around with his torso and head like a worm. He had lost his pair of legs, arms, eyes, and lost most of his teeth and had his tongue cut off. He couldn't see, he couldn't speak, he couldn't walk. He couldn't touch, but he could still feel and think and hear. And he was feeling scared and thinking of the worse. Big Mom, who was overseeing this, just kept grinning and grinning on. She closed her eyes while swaying her hands like a music conductor, hearing Porkamy's screams of agony. It was delightful. Not as delightful as her son's singing voice, but still delightful nonetheless. Big Mom decided to kill two birds with one stone with the aftermath. "Good work, my children," she said, clapping her hands slowly like how an audience does at the end of a play. "Now, gather all of his sliced off body parts and show it to those bastards locked up to persuade and motivate them to tell us where their main base is." "Yes, Mama, and as for Porkamy, put him on a boat." At that the Charlottes were confused why they were letting him go, while some caught on what their mother was doing with Porkamy and nodded in approval over this. Big Mom, noticing how some of her children were confused, so she explained. "He can't do anything in this state. Wouldn't it be hell for a person who can't see, move nor speak to be sailing out into the ocean on a small boat, drifting off alone with the only company being whatever you hear?" At that the Charlottes shuddered at that thought before finally understanding what Big Mom was doing. Yep, Porkamy was probably begging for death. Too bad they were all sadistic just like their mother and decided to let him live the in that poor state. And Porkamy was dropped onto a boat which they pushed off into wherever it would end up. He could starve out in the sea, be eaten by sea king, maybe miraculously reach an island where the residents would help the bastard. But one thing's for sure, he will suffer till someone puts him out of his misery. At the waiting room, "Welp, sounds like they're done," Pudding said, clapping her hands, letting go of Anana's ears. The older siblings went towards the ones who were 12 and under to cover their ears so they could avoid hearing the screams. Sure, they were all twisted in several ways, but they want to at least let their baby siblings enjoy an innocent and normal life before they end up just like them. The Charlottes had solemn expression the whole way through the ordeal. They know, judging by the screams, that this was the most brutal punishment the family had given to a person so far. But for what he did, it was well deserved. "How do you feel?" Flamp asked, tilting her head at Luffy. His torturer just got tortured after all. Bitch deserved it though. "Hungry," he said bluntly while his stomach growled, not showing any signs of giving a shit of Porkami's fate. They sweat dropped at that. After getting more food from the kitchen to feed their brother, they just stalled and chilled until one of their siblings who was on deck came down to tell them they could come back onto the deck again. In the meantime, the younger siblings were in a circle with their older brother Luffy in the center while the older ones kept back in their sofas, couches and seats. To kill time, the older siblings told him to talk about his journeys and enemies he has faced off in paradise, and suffice to say, they were all interested in his stories as he was the only Charlotte besides Chiffon that went on a journey. "Then, we went to the reverse mountains to enter the Grand Line," Luffy exclaimed while the child siblings were interested in the next part of the stories. He finished telling his siblings about his adventures in Logia Town where he survived not only an execution attempt, but a fucking lightning strike. They still couldn't wrap around the idea of the bizarre events that unfolded there and the amount of luck it required for him to survive that shit. "What happened there?" Anglais asked eagerly with a big smile on his face with anticipating eyes. Like all of his siblings, he was enraptured and was shaking a bit from excitement. This was better than the storybooks they were read to. Luffy stood up with a big grin while pointing up. "We sailed upwards the mountains, but a giant whale appeared and blocked our way." The younger siblings gasped at the new development. "He sure is good at telling stories about his adventures," Chiffon commented, smiling a bit while leaning forward, invested in his stories. "There's just a certain aura around him that could make people feel joy when he does something." "This Arlong guy, do you think he's related to the Sun Pirates?" Opera asked while rubbing his chin. All they knew about the man was the fact that his fish trade was that of a shark and he had a tattoo of the Sun Pirates who ruled over one of Luffy's crewmates' home island. The Sun Pirate tattoo is normally a way to either layer on or get rid of the slave mark that was burned into their skin. They never truly paid much attention towards the news that happens in paradise because there never really was anything interesting. The shit people go through in the New World pales in comparison to paradise. They had to give it to their brother though. His first bounty was 30 million berry, which made him one of the few siblings who had such a high starting bounty. Katakori's first bounty was around 39,100,000 berry, Smoothie's one was 37,780,000 while Cracker and Snack tied with a 35 million berry worth on their head. If he started in the New World, he probably would have gotten a similar bounty to theirs. New World pirates tend to get a higher starting one. Although their mother still stood on top with a 50 million berry bounty on her head and she was also way younger too when she first got it. "We should ask Praline or Prim to ask that question when they get there," Bassan suggested. The siblings nodded at that before going back to listening about their brother's tales of adventures. "Then, what happened? Did you crash into the whale?" Nutmeg, Harumeg and Almeg asked, interested in what would happen next. Luffy just shook his head. "Nope. We were able to slow down in time." Then he pouted. "But the ship's figurehead was broken. It was my favorite seat." "Oh, so you just repaired it and went past the whale, right?" Norman tilting her head while sitting on Pudding's shoulder. "Nope. Then what did you do?" "I punched him in the eye." "I see you, eh? The siblings either dropped their jaws, looked on in amazement and amusement, or pinched their nose or facepalm at what he did. They really wanted to know what happened next, but the door opened with a kick, courtesy of Cracker, who upon stepping in, saw his siblings give him a "Are you serious?" look and started looking sheepish at that. Seemed he interrupted something important. "Bad timing?" he asked. "Bad timing," they nodded and said in response. Whatever, continue it on deck or she stuff like that." He cut himself off from swearing when the siblings aged 13 and above except for Luffy gave him a look that dared him to cuss. They didn't want to deal with Anglais and his baby siblings asking what shit meant. It would be an absolute fuck fiesta to explain it to them, especially if Mama was involved. The siblings begrudgingly got up and went up to deck, pouting a bit about how their brother didn't explain about what happened after he punched a whale in the eye, much to Cracker's mass confusion with gears turning in his head to process what the hell they were talking about in there that lead up to that point. When they reached the deck, they spotted their siblings all with looks of satisfaction on their face, as if they accomplished a lifelong goal. There were also mops with buckets filled with very red water, although the decks still had a couple of bloodstains all over it. Sue, how did it go? Panna asked, tilting her head with a finger on her chin, wondering. Let's just say, Perispero stepped forward while rubbing his chin, choosing his words to describe Porkami's punishment. There isn't much he can do in his state except wait and hope for his death, Peroin. He finally said after much thinking, is that so? It was best to leave it at that. The description would probably be gruesome to even hear about. Perispero nodded at her before looking at Cracker to give him another task from Mama. Cracker, Mama said you should carry out the talk with our guests along with Snack Puro, Perispero said while holding a wooden crate out. It was sealed off with no way to know what the content was inside and was labeled, persuasive material, on one of the sides. And if you look closely, you could see the faint traces of blood that was clearly wiped off the box. Cracker coldly smirked. Is that so? Alright, I will make them talk. Cracker went to Snack so they could go down to the holding cell to converse with their guest. Anyway, what were you guys doing down there? Perispero asked out of curiosity. Oh, little bro was talking about his adventures to our younger siblings down there, Panna exclaimed cheerfully. Perispero raised his eyebrow a bit. Ho? Is that so? He asked to particularly nobody while turning towards his baby siblings who were expressing faces of joy and happiness. Yeah, Luffy Nissan's stories are better than the ones told in storybooks, Anglais exclaimed cheerfully with his siblings who were around his age were also sharing their positive opinion over their brother's storytelling skills. Perispero just hummed in acknowledgement over this. Their little brother had probably been through a lot after all. Although, the 12-year-old boy trailed off while turning towards Luffy and pointing at him. You didn't finish about what happened with the whale, he shouted while the rest of the siblings nodded at that. Yeah, what happened when you punched that whale in the eye? Fuyumeg stepped forward and asked. What? Oh, my nakama along with the ship got swallowed by the whale. Huh? What? The older siblings were surprised or raised their eyebrows at the fact that Luffy apparently punched a whale in the eye. But were slammed with the immediate aftermath, which was the fact his ship along with his crew got fucking eaten too. Big Mom, who had heard it, looked on amused. She wasn't really fazed, she sailed with the Bloody Rock's crew after all. They all had their attention towards their rubber brother who just laughed at the dumbfounded expressions on some of the siblings' faces. -5 minutes later, the Charlottes, except for Cracker and Snack who were conversing with their hostages below, gathered around their rubber brother while Lin just loomed over them from behind. So, what happened after you got swallowed by the whale? Ewan asked cheerfully, sitting down while Draggy and Dolce were floating above him. Mont Dore had a book in handled, The Adventures of Charlotte D. Luffy. He went around asking his siblings who were downstairs about the previous tales while writing at a rapid pace. After finishing gathering the information until now, he quickly wrote down the next entry. The Reverse Mountain Arc, writing down all about how Luffy punched a whale in the eye and then how the whale proceeded to eat his ship along with the crew. He now was waiting for the next piece of information. He was going to dive, so I quickly found a door on its back and got in. If it was any normal person, they would have found that ludicrous and unbelievable. But for experienced sailors, especially the ones in the New World, this wasn't all that bizarre than the shit they had already experienced. So naturally they just let him continue on without question. That's where we met the doctor tending the whale, Crocus. The children oohed at that while the older ones hummed in acknowledgement. Big Mom though narrowed her eyes at that. That name sounded familiar. He's a cool old guy who was helping the whale when it kept ramming into the mountain because of personal issues. Personal issues? One of them asked, tilting their heads. Yeah, it's Brooks' whale friend, Laboon. Remembering their talk with him about his crewmates, they could piece together what the personal issue is. The whale must have wanted to ram through the mountain to find this Brook guy and his former crew. Luffy told them all how he fought the whale, much to the siblings' disbelief and amusement, and made a promise to bring the skeleton's ass, or pelvis, back to Laboon after a long-ass time of being separated from each other. He later went on to explain how he traveled to Whiskey Peak with Vivi and Mr. Nine, who he had run into while looking for his crew inside Laboon, where they were ambushed by bounty hunters which they swiftly dealt with. He also revealed that they were working with the former warlord Crocodile and how he also dealt with a few of his agents along with the bounty hunters in that island, much to their surprise a bit. They were more surprised as it turns out this Vivi girl was the fucking princess of Arabasta. And then they set sail towards an island according to their brother. An island where Linlin would be very much interested in. After we beat up those guys, we went to Little Garden. Little Garden. Linlin trailed off thinking with a finger on her chin. She could remember faint memories when she was a child still living in Sheep's house at Elbath before they moved away to another island, much to Linlin's confusion back when she was a naive kid. She never understood why the giants hated her. She remembered craving semla before going unconscious and waking up to the giants who either looked sad or had anger and fury directed at her, with the houses mysteriously being destroyed as if they went through a disaster. From what she heard upon waking up, Jorel died from unknown cause while she was asleep according to Mother Caramel. Although as time went by and she became an adult, she could piece together the reasoning for the giants' fury and hatred for her. She went into one of her hunger pangs. She became aware of them when Newgate talked about how she went on a rampage, shouting and demanding for crackers before a very UMAMUSED and annoyed captain punched her with a haki-coated fist back when they were sailing with rocks. And went on a rampage beating giants up before Jorel tried to stop her. But in doing so he got himself killed by her during her blind rampage looking for semla. Mother Caramel must have avoided telling the true cause of Jorel's death because she was still a child back then. Even though she is gone, she truly was a great mother to Linlin for her to not make her feel the guilt and repercussions of her gluttony. If only she knew. She shook her thoughts before thinking about Little Garden again. She remembered how Jorel and Jarul talked about the fate of their successors who were to be the next captains of the giant warrior pirates, and how their last sighting was around Little Garden according to the crew members who were saved by Mother Caramel. They believed their captains had died or been captured, but no one knew for sure. What was it like? What kind of inhabitants are there? Is the place little? Were some of the questions being thrown at Luffy, who just grinned and talked about his journey and how he made two big friends. Little Garden wasn't small at all. It was huge as hell. I don't know why they called it Little Garden instead of Big Garden though. Luffy said, shrugging while tilting his head. He was expecting it to be a small island, but instead it was a colossal island full of dinosaurs that Sabo had talked about in the storybooks back in Fuchsia. Katakuri widened his eyes in surprise a bit. There were a lot of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs? The Charlottes shouted in surprise and awe over the fact their brother found dinosaurs. Fucking dinosaurs that were supposed to be instinct. Now, they know that there are zone fruits that give you the ability to turn into a dinosaur, but seeing the ancient animal itself up close and personal was slim to none. Even Linlin seemed surprised and mentally added Little Garden into her list of islands of interest. She could also use this chance to send Mont d'Or and a few of her children to explore somewhere else or once to study and capture these strange animals that her son had mentioned. Dinosaurs would be a nice addition to the forest parts of Toto Land. Maybe she should start a zoo, she internally mused. Yeah, dinosaurs. Luffy nodded in confirmation while grinning a bit in amusement over his siblings' faces. But how? They went extinct. Viro, the long-necked child, asked in surprise with widened eyes, although his hair covered them. Honestly, I don't know. Sabo told me they went extinct too till I found them. Luffy said while pouting a bit. He was pretty shocked when he came across the dinosaurs Sabo had mentioned before in books. He had been excited to meet one when he started sailing out, but that was immediately shot down with Sabo giving him a sheepish look with him explaining they were all gone. Well, until he actually sailed and visited Little Garden where he actually saw said extinct animals and made two big friends. Well, anyways, me and Vivi went into the forest. The plants and trees were huge. Katakuri was a stoic man, but he couldn't help but display a very rare expression that displayed emotions he rarely shown. Surprise, disbelief and slight fear. We later came across Dory and Brogy, and they were giants we made friends with. Silence. Nothing but silence. Luffy even kept silent instead of asking what was wrong when all his siblings looked at him in surprise and disbelief. But this was different. Their eyes were wide with their pupils shaking a bit. Their mouths were hanging without any signs of closing, and they immediately went stiff as a statue. Every second that passes, the heavier and suffocating the atmosphere felt. The Charlottes wanted to ask questions, speak basic words. They wanted to let out a sound, anything to break the silence. But they couldn't. They stood like that before Katakuri slowly turned to look at their mother. The siblings lagged behind before following their eldest brother's action. They knew what their mother would feel and look like at this revelation, but they were still surprised to see such emotions displayed on her face. She was frozen stiff with a look of surprise. Although surprise was an extremely heavy understatement, it's just that there were no words anyone could describe her facial expression. "You made friends with giants?" Big Mom finally broke the silence with an unexpectedly very soft voice which surprised her children again. Luffy nodded at that. "Yeah, Dory and Brogy are these awesome guys that has been fighting for over 100 years. They are really strong. And also big and tall just like you," he said, not really knowing how strong his mother was, surprising him about how she was a Yonko for some reason yet. Luffy then grinned up towards her. "You should meet them. They would like to fight another giant their size." His siblings whipped their head at him in surprise before quickly looking at their mother. They knew her ambitions and goals after all. At that, Big Mom looked down towards the deck in deep thought while taking her hand and clenching her other arm, squeezing it. If it were her past self, she would have immediately agreed, set sail towards paradise after dealing with the organ harvesting group and not give a shit about how the Marines would be panicking over a Yonko in paradise. But now, she didn't know what to do. She refused Loki's marriage proposal, which would have effectively created an alliance between her and the giants, because she didn't want to hurt her daughter by marrying someone she didn't really know and show romantic interest to. But in doing so, it probably caused her relations with giants to sour even further now. She could tell by Loki's voice turning soft before turning into anger and sadness when she denied him the hand of her daughter when conversing about the political marriage. And now she was given a chance by her son to meet up with two giants. A chance to finally make friends and possibly even have giants in Toto Land if she could persuade them. Her goal and drive was to bring every race possible into one place to unify and make Toto Land a safe haven where everyone wouldn't discriminate amongst each other. And yet it was the same drive and ambition that made her neglect her children and saw them as nothing more than tools or stepping stones for her own ambitions rather than giving a shit for her own children. Her own fucking children were glossed over and ignored in favor of her dream, which was ironic in of itself with how she waved off and downright insulted some of how her children looked, which was the exact thing she wanted to avoid in Toto Land, discrimination. She gave more of a shit towards her people and subjects rather than her own children. And it took one of her sons being kidnapped in order for her to wake the fuck up and realize the sack of shit she had been towards her spawns. Did she deserve to even to reach for her goals or even try and meet the giants? Does she even deserve to be a mother? And the memories came flooding like a tsunami, carrying needles and shrapnel in its waves that slammed into her full force. Memories before Luffy's kidnapping. Memories where she was still a bitch. Memories which eats away at her soul with guilt. But one memory stood out among the rest. Katakuri's mouth had been stretched wide open back when he was 3 and when some of her children and herself were still on the Rocks Pirates ship. She ignored her donut-loving son who was trying to give an explanation as to why his mouth ended up like that towards her, which was poorly cleaned off with the blood still visible. She had immediately assumed back at the time that he accidentally stuffed too many donuts into his mouth due to his fast eating habits and it just ripped, and she turned deaf to his cries of reasoning while throwing a needle and some string at her son and told him to stitch it up and went off to the nearest bed to lay down on. She didn't even fucking bother to comfort him or try to listen to him. Looking back at it again, the words that she did pick up from Katakuri back then just kept repeating inside of her head, which was joined with many voices of anguish and sorrow from her own children that cried to their mother for any form of help which she didn't offer back them. Bastard. Knife. Sliced open. It wasn't because of him obsessively eating, it was because a fucking crewmate went and sliced his mouth open. And it took Luffy's birth and her trying to redeem herself did she finally start to see the many forms of suffering and pain that her children been put through, especially the older ones. It took almost 30 fucking years for her to finally realize why her son's mouth had actually been split open when he was 3. And it was obvious in plain sight if she even bothered to look at the scar on her son's face, with said scar looking like it was done with a sharp object rather than looking like it was ripped open. And he was just one of many of the eldest that she neglected. Again, she internally asked, did someone like her deserve to be a mother for what she did? But it was joined with even more depressing thoughts. Would her own children smile brighter if she was gone? Did she even deserve to be alive for being a horrendous excuse for a mother? Did her parents abandon her because they knew she was bound to turn into the monster she had now become? Invisible aura of depression and sorrow slowly started surrounding her. Her breathing got heavier and the grip on her arm was tighter to the point it looked like she could rip a chunk off by how hard she was clutching it. The light in her eyes dimmed a bit before going dead. Her orange eyes seemed to darken like the sun was going down. Her children tensed a bit before frowning and also having a depressing aura around them when they realized what was going on, although it wasn't as bad as their mothers right now. Luffy on the other hand looked on in silent shock at Linlin. Back when he was a child, he could read people's emotions and their nature pretty damn well, which he never really questioned much of and just wrote it off as good instincts. He knew who was good and bad or sad and happy. Ace was the first person he had come across who looked so lonely before he later met Sabo, who was also lonely. Just like him, he made a vow to become their friends and later their brother, which he did not expect but was glad and happy it happened, and he brought them out of their sad states much to both of his older brothers' gratefulness and happiness for. And then there was his mother's sudden severe depressing state. She was in a far worse state than Pudding, Sabo or Ace. After a couple of seconds, Big Mom slowly stood up with her expression hidden with her head low and hair covering her face. I'm going to lie down in a room for a bit, she muttered out emotionlessly. Oh okay, Smoothie said with a rare stutter in her voice while looking down with her arms dangling down. She felt a pang in her heart from looking at the state her mother was in and how she could not do jack shit in helping her. The children also looked down or away while showing various degrees of negative emotions. After their mother left the deck and descended down towards the lower parts of the ship, they were left in an awkward and depressing silence, as if they were at a funeral. What's wrong with Mama? Luffy broke the silence with a surprisingly unexpected soft and quiet tone. He tilted his head towards his siblings with a frown on his face. That was Mama's depression state. Luffy turned back to see Cracker and Snack, who came out from where their mother was and also looked quite down about it. They knew from how their mother was acting when they met at the stairs. Their mother stopped moving when Cracker and Snack were in her way before she quietly and softly told them to move out of the way, to which they did, much to their shock that turned to sadness when they realized the state she was in. Depression state? Cracker nodded while Snack stepped forward to explain further. Mama's depression state is when she starts to relapse and remember what she was like after you were born, Snack said after thinking when the depression phase started. It was something the Charlottes hated and felt sad for whenever it happened. It was worser than her hunger pangs because at least they knew that they needed some specific food to stop her hunger pangs. But her depression state was something the siblings couldn't snap their mother out of. They wanted to comfort her, but they couldn't. Mama's guilt and sorrow was beyond heartbreaking to see, but they couldn't approach to help her make her feel better. She had already made amends to them by being better, but he didn't do much with how she still has visible guilt in her eyes whenever she gazes at them. They didn't know how the hell they were supposed to comfort her when she sees them as her victims. If she made eye contact with one of them, she would get startled and moved back and her eyes would start to get watery before telling them to go away, which they hesitantly obeyed. If they disobey and chose to move forward, she would back up into a corner, slump down and hug her knees, rock back and forward while repeating over and over again, "I'm a monster. Stay away." It pained them even more when she quietly added she didn't want to hurt them anymore, and quietly cry while getting rid of the tears in a poor attempt to hide them from her children's sight. She looked so weak, vulnerable, sad, lonely, dead. We managed to break the prisoners and make them spill everything. We know where their main base of operations is located at, Snack said, trailing off in deep thought about what their next approach should be. But it's pretty far, and considering Mama's state, we should head home and prepare to attack them when Mama recovers, although they will be probably prepared for our arrival when their group doesn't report back. The Charlottes looked at each other and silently agreed to turn the ship around and set off back to Toto Land ASAP. They needed to go home quickly, for Mama's sake. The only sounds heard and made while they sailed back was the muffled cries of a guilt-ridden mother. And a silent spark of determination that lit up inside their rubber brother. Chapter 17. Heading back home was quite miserable with how their mother was sobbing all the way through. The Charlottes present on deck were grimacing and frowning while hearing their mother cry her heart out with guilt in her voice. The younger ones were going teary-eyed, worried about their mother, with their older siblings comforting them, telling them Mama will be okay in reassurance. Upon anchoring in the port, They just went back to the whole cake castle in silence while their mother loomed behind them just staring down at the floor with her hair covering her facial expression. The citizens were quite shocked by the depressive aura that surrounded their queen along with her children. Upon entering the castle, Big Mom just ignored her servants' greetings and went straight to her bedroom much to their confusion, until Katakuri told them about the state she was in, which caused them to frown in understanding of the situation, with the higher-ranking servants giving orders to follow the protocols and instructions given when this situation popped up. The Charlottes were now gathered inside the dining room with the servants asking them if they wanted anything, which they immediately rejected. They didn't have much of an appetite considering the situation right now. After dismissing the servants to have a personal discussion amongst themselves, no words were uttered after the doors closed. Intel. What was Mama like before I got kidnapped? Luffy, after a couple of seconds of silence, asked while tilting his head and frowning over Mama's depression. At this question, Galette, Poire and the Charlottes below or near their age also were curious about that matter. Mama treated them kindly when they were kids, but when Luffy's kidnapping happened, she still was kind and caring to them and all, but it felt more sincere and more affectionate. The older ones on the other hand stiffened at that question, especially the long-necked quadruplets, the eldest triplets along with Compote and Perispero. They sailed with Rocks before Mama became a captain of her own crew. The Rocks were brutal with how they always fight and kill each other on deck out of pure boredom when they aren't plundering or attacking something the captain had his eyes on. And even if they were children, they still had to keep their guard up and show no weakness if they wanted to stay. Katakuri found out the hard way when one carved his mouth. It was the first time Katakuri killed someone later out of anger and to protect his siblings for what the bastard did when he threatened and taunted him about how he would make sure he wouldn't feel alone by carving his other siblings too, which caused him to snap and become bloodthirsty with a mix of protectiveness. It was a very different time back then, Katakuri said. Mama was pretty gluttonous and greedy. She would normally never share candy nor sweets with us when we reached 13. Only when she was in a good mood or when we were starving would she even bother sharing some of her sweets to us, which was rare in itself. We would normally just go out and buy our own sweets and candy to enjoy. Perispero said with eyes closed without ending his words, without his usual purro or peroin at the end. She was a far cry to who she was now, a more affectionate and caring mother. Never annoyed or angered when one of them asked for sweets from her own plate, which she gave with a smile, sometimes even insisting on them trying some candy from her own plate and even her own stash. We found out from Streusen that Mama was abandoned by her own parents before being adopted by Caramel, before she and along with other orphans just disappeared from her somehow. Because of this, Mama never was taught morales. What was right or wrong was something she didn't give a shit about. She ended up becoming quite cruel and neglectful to us and to her own subordinates because of that. Compote said, clutching her other arm in reminiscent. She was born as a mellowed-down version of her mother, an absurdly strong body with strength to boot with it. Appearance-wise, apart from her choice of clothes and different hair and eye color, she looked like a shrunken-down version of Big Mom around her 30s, even though she was nearly in her 50s now. Compote chalked it up to Mama's genetics or her devil fruit meddling with their appearances, considering Mama herself didn't seem to age. The giant woman was in her 60s, but she still looked around her 30s. Hell, she still looked the same from Compote's childhood until now, although she did start showing signs of changing when Mama was in her 40s, but it didn't seem like aging. It looked like her appetite and gluttony had made her put on weight. Although after Luffy's kidnapping, Mama had locked herself in a room for a week straight in isolation where they could hear her sobs and cries slowly getting quieter and quieter as the hours and days go by. She finally came out when her hunger became too much to bear after being deprived of food for a week straight. Compote and her siblings, who saw their mother finally coming out of her room after a week, were horrified, pale and worried when they saw Mama's state. They could see her bones visibly underneath her dress and skin. That was how skinny she had become. After finally being fed, the day after that horrifying and extremely rare sight of Mama starving, Big Mom's usual ravenous hunger for food mellowed down drastically, everything tasting sour and bitter to her, and the change of taste were one of many things Mama developed after the accident. Going from usually 5 to 10 plates filled to the brim with food that were stacked on top of each other at a steady pace, turned down to a moderate amount of 2 to 3 plates which she goes through at a very slow pace. Compote even sometimes sees her mother struggling to digest or even eat during breakfast, lunch and dinner during the first few months. Compote shook her head when she felt her facial expression slowly turning into a look of grimace from the memories and went back to the topic about Mama's youth. Her devil fruit allows her to replenish or add onto her lifespan via the souls of those who are unfortunate enough to cross her path and tick her off. Maybe some excess lifespan from Mama was passed down into Compote along with her siblings, thus making them age slowly but not as slow as their mother. Compote mentally shrugged that theory off before looking down at her hands. Just like Mama, she had been gifted with monstrous physical strength. And just like her, she didn't know how to control her strength when she was a child. She would accidentally break cups if she puts a bit of strength into it, rip doors from their hinges if she slammed them too hard, but the worst thing she did was break Parasparrow's ribs when she hugged him a little too hard. She cried like a little bitch and worried like hell when he coughed up blood while reassuring he was perfectly fine, with a smile on his face, saying he just drank an entire bottle of ketchup which he coughed up in surprise over how she hugged him and how the cracking sound was someone snapping a piece of broccoli to eat it and not his bones. Even though she was still a child, she was neither a dumbass nor naive about how Parasparrow was trying not to make her feel guilty, which was a very sad and poor attempt, like stabbing a person and they reassure the stabber that they did nothing wrong. The supposed ketchup had a metallic smell which she was 99.99% sure it was not supposed to have, and there was no broccoli in the storage room, she had checked after all, courtesy of her boredom and hunger which made her steal pieces of food and generally because, fuck the Rocks pirates, but Parasparrow still kept denying about it. Well, until he passed out, that is. Due to this, she never cradled nor carried her siblings who were still babies in fear of accidentally crushing them to death until she eventually learned to control her own strength, which she did at the age of 12. When she asked her mother for help before she mastered her control and strength, she waved confidently saying, "If I could figure it out myself." "You definitely can, you are my child after all." To which she did with great fucking difficulty. In fact, Mama not only ignored her but her other younger siblings too, saying she has other matters to attend to, or was brutally honest by saying she didn't give a shit about what they accomplished, only if what they did helped her own endeavors rather than theirs. Sure, she had been honest, but damn, maybe she could have lied a bit or left out some details from her sentences back then. Well, at least she now has genuine affection and her attention for them with how she drops whatever she is doing whenever we walk up and talk to her, Compote internally thought in relief. But even so, she still had some genuine affection for us which she denied a lot back then. Amanda said with a small smile on her face while touching her hat, their mother might have been cruel and sometimes harmful towards them back when they were still children. But even so, she still had some shred of warmth in her heart. The long-necked woman remembered when she was a teenager, she woke up at night and left her room to get a glass of water. Walking off to the kitchen, she went off into the corridor and saw something interesting. The library door slightly opened with light peeking through. As the curious child that she was, she went up and took a look inside, and when she did, she had to put her hand over her mouth to suppress her gasp of surprise. There, sitting on a chair while humming peacefully, was her mother, sewing a massive hat along with 3 other smaller hats on a table. And finally, Lin reached out for a couple of flowers that were strung together before putting it on top of the large hat. There, Amanda was again surprised by the genuine joy in her tone and face. She had never seen Mama smiled so sincerely or so genuinely before. Amanda decided she had seen enough before going to the kitchen for a drink and proceeded to head back to her bedroom and slept. Although it was hard to sleep with that scene of her mother making a hat stuck in her head playing on repeat. And when she woke up, she again was taken aback the 3rd time when said hat Mama was working on was lying on her bed with a red ribbon tied to it. She found a tag which labeled, "To Charlotte Amanda. Wear it. Someone you know." Mama was making a present just for her late at night. She was too surprised to even notice the tears in her eyes. She hugged the hat close to the chest and slightly smiled. She thought Mama never cared for them. But here was the proof of her love, even if it wasn't much, although she would have never known if she stayed asleep. She truly cared about them, and it wasn't just her reminiscing about a gift from Mama. Mundy, Hachi and Effler touched their hats too with a soft look. Amanda was the one who told them about who gave them their gifts, which would have sounded ridiculous if it was anyone else. Yeah, The other older Charlottes nodded, before they chorused as one. She has changed for the better. The younger siblings looked in awe over the emotions displayed on their older brothers and sisters' faces. They looked so relief, happy, smiles that they don't usually see on the stoic ones were there for all to see in the dining room. Luffy looked in awe before smiling, and decided to sneak off under their noses. Pudding was smiling over the emotional moment before taking small glances to see her other siblings' reaction. And found Luffy missing. Nay, Pudding called out to all of them, which got their attention. What? Where's Luffy Nisan? Huh? Shit. At Big Mom's bedroom. Big Mom was curled up in her bed crying quietly but heavily with Prometheus, Zeus, who were looming over her sadly while taking a glance at each other, and Napoleon, who was placed on the bedside table looking worried for Mama. It had been like this once Mama stepped into her room and walked directly towards her bed. They tried to speak to her, but when they made a sound, she would jump a bit and started shaking, which had silenced them. As homies who were always by Mama's side since their creation, they felt like utter shit seeing their mother in such a sorrowful state. They felt so useless. They could do nothing but fucking stare at her and worry and not comforting her like they want to. And what they were staring at right now was their mother going through a plethora of emotions. If they try and talk, it seems she reacted by getting anxious and began shaking a lot more than she previously was, while mumbling even more incoherently about something, which made them back off in fear of getting an even more frantic reaction out of her. They took glances at the door, hoping for a miracle that someone opened the door. Someone who could get rid of Mama's sorrow. And their prayers were answered in the form of someone who definitely could. Big Mom's paw, Lin, was staring at her hands, which were shaking heavily while in a deep abyss of thoughts. Throughout her life, she wanted to create a place where all are unified and living happily amongst the other races, a land that was a dream. An Eden. And she did make the Eden. Sure, even though there were still a few races missing, it was a haven for all. But she had been a snake. She was like a wolf among sheep, a peaceful place where the peaceful inhabitants shared their residence with her, a natural-born monster. Most of the damages and casualties had been because of her hunger pangs rather than outside threats. She was a ticking bomb with no time counter nor any indication of when she would set off. And the worst part was, said ticking bomb was surrounded by her children. The only thing she could do was open her eyes and witness the aftermath caused by her from her hunger pangs. It was only a month ago, where she opened her eyes after tasting some delicious pudding in her mouth while surrounded by destroyed buildings. A month ago, where she was beyond horrified when she looked down and found her fist nearly making contact with Oven, who was using his body to protect his child siblings. He was going to sacrifice himself to save his siblings, who were still 12 and under, from their own mother. She had been a mere second away from opening her eyes to find one of her oldest children along with some of her other kids who hadn't reached 13 yet, lying dead on the floor, killed by her. What had she ever been good for besides destruction, really? Was she born and made to be a being that destroys all that are close to her? Then a thought came to mind. A theory she had shoved to the bottom pits of her dark thoughts. Did she kill them? Did she kill her orphan friends alongside Mother Caramel? She started breathing heavier but was able to somewhat shove that theory back down and went back to her somewhat lighter but still heavy and dark thoughts. She was so deep in thought, she never saw how light started to shine in the room from the door. She forgot to lock it. Just like a fish biting a bait and getting reeled into the surface, she was pulled out of the black sea inside her mind by the words of a child. Her child. Mama? 2 minutes ago. Luffy walked up to the giant door and just opened it, not bothering to be quiet and subtle with it. Surprisingly, the door didn't even creak even with the strong push. He poked his head through the door while observing the inside while scanning around for where Mama was. Looking at the right corner, he spotted a huge mirror that was accommodated for her size. The mirror's frame had an elegant design made with silver. Shifting his gaze from the mirror, he looked further towards the right and saw a dressing table along with several picture frames hanging above it. The pictures themselves display what looked like his siblings when they were younger messing around. But that wasn't what he was here for. Stepping further inside the room, he now looked at the left side and saw who he was looking for. Mamad by a sun, cloud and a hat that made eye contact with him. Luffy tilted his head at the three homies who were giving a look of hope towards him with neither one of them breaking eye contact, and after a while, He smiled at them before he called out towards her. Present, Big Mom quickly wiped away her tears before she slowly looked up to see her son. Lu. FFY. Yo. Luffy just raised his hand to wave at her and noticed how she twitched her hands slightly at that. They stayed silent with Luffy just tilting his head towards her when he noticed how his giant mother was shaking a bit. Luffy was worried about the behavior his mother was displaying and walked forward. Oi. What's ro? Stay away. He stopped dead in his track looking a bit shocked before going back to his original expression when she said that while also noticing how she was shaking more and moved a bit further away from him. Luffy stepped forward and she pushed herself back with her legs further on her bed in response. It continued until eventually Big Mom finally had her back touching the back of the wall and curled up while muttering something under her breath. Noticing her behavior becoming worse, Luffy became even more concerned. With one arm stretched and latching onto the bed frame, he yanked himself towards and onto the mattress with Zeus, Prometheus and Napoleon looking towards him tensed at the situation. One wrong approach and a couple of poor choices of words could cause an eruption of very volatile emotions from Mama. And unfortunately for them, Luffy wasn't the type to tiptoe on a minefield. He is the kind of guy that would run around without giving much of a fuck of setting one off. Luffy stretched one arm and grabbed onto Mama's arm, and before she could react, he had already thrown himself towards her face and thud smacked against her forehead before falling on his ass, now sitting on one of her arms. The three homies witnessing this event just had a dumbfounded expression on their face. Linlin and Luffy just stared awkwardly. Linlin wasn't sure what to do. Normally her children would respectively keep their distance, but before she could think of what to do. Are you still sad about being a bastard to my brothers and sisters? Luffy asked bluntly while tilting his head with a serious expression on his face pointed at her all the while crossed sitting on her arm with his arms and legs. Now the homies paled considerably with Zeus somehow getting whiter than he is. Of all things to say, they could only think of one thing about this situation, and it was, bruh. Linlin at that flinched and tensed painfully over her son's very poor choice of words to start this conversation. She averted her gaze from Luffy and looked downwards, feeling the shame and guilt for what she had done towards her own flesh and blood. Luffy took this as a sign of a yes and restrained a grumble in frustration. You sure are an idiot, you know? Zeus, Napoleon and Prometheus didn't believe they could have their jaws hanging lower as they were now. But Luffy proved them wrong with that follow-up, a very fucking shitty one at that too. Oh, we are beyond FUUUUUUCKED, aren't we? They thought as one. At that Linlin whimpered while slowly nodding. Yeah, she had been stupid. How could she make a safe haven where all could live happily when she attacked and neglected her own children? Why yay. I had been a shit excuse of a mother wasn't. You aren't, Luffy shouted while sounding like he was whining simultaneously. Big Mom twitched in surprise before whipping her head to now make eye-to-eye contact with her son wide-eyed. Are you still ignoring them? Luffy asked tilting his head in confusion. It was like talking with Jinbei all over again. Now Big Mom gaped before raising her voice slightly to respond. No. Are you mean to them? He now lied on his side propped up on one elbow with his hand supporting his head without breaking eye contact. Big Mom gritted her teeth a bit and replied with her normal voice now. No, are you cold to them? Luffy now raised an eyebrow at her looking even more confused. Big Mom raised her voice a bit and replied with more emotion. No, so you love us? Luffy broke the serious expression on his face and smiled up at her knowing what her response will be. Of course I do. Then how are you a shitty mother? Luffy finally asked the big question. She was about to say something, but found herself unable to. Linlin couldn't respond and just kept opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air. She couldn't really find the words to retort against that statement. Luffy continued on while slowly getting onto his feet and standing up. If you were a shitty mother, then why do you pay attention to them? Why are you kind to them? Why are you warm to them? Why do you love them? Linlin widened her eyes a bit and went deep in thought, and for once it wasn't dark. And from those thoughts, she could only think of one thing. They are my children, why wouldn't I love them? For once, her thoughts could be heard out loud, which surprised herself. She never talked out loud what she was thinking. Luffy beamed up at her while also adding on. See? You are a good mother. But I still hurt them. Back then Mama, You already made up for that by apologizing to us and being better." Lin widened her eyes and looked behind Luffy, who also seemed surprised, and followed her gaze, and saw her long-legged daughter peeking her head behind the door while pouting a bit. She had never seen her daughter had such a childish expression since she hit 12. Smoothie? Another one of her child's head popped up from the door while looking grumpy. "We already got over it and moved on, there's no point about being sad and shit over the past." Cracker. Bonk that earned him a smack in the head with a candy staff, courtesy of the eldest child, which had Cracker dropping and rolling on the floor while holding his head in pain, which had his triplet sisters giggling with a hand over their mouths from behind. "Indeed, Paroin, it's all in the past and you became better, mama, and besides, all of us have forgiven you already." Paraspero. The eldest just smiled and walked in further while waving behind him, which made the rest of the siblings to walk inside. Big Mom didn't know what to say when all 86 children were gathered in her room while looking up at her. Faces of amusement, faces of happiness, faces of joy, faces of relief. Even some of her children who were cold, distant and stoic had a positive look pointed right at her. Paraspero wordlessly waved his staff and made a candy spiral stairway up to their mama's bed. Paraspero walked up first before being followed by the rest of his siblings. Luffy, seeing his siblings coming towards them, just grinned before jumping down to walk up to them and went to Paraspero's side, both youngest and eldest looking at each other, one with happiness pouring out of him, with the latter showing amusement and fondness while resting and rubbing the other's head, before raising and lightly chopping the youngest's head. "You sure have an interesting choice of words to use when speaking with Mama Paroin," the long-tongued sibling sighing while his rubber brother just laughed in response. Paraspero along with the rest of his siblings were outside of their mother's room, listening in on what their brother was saying to make their mother better. The amount of emotions they went through was like experiencing the weather of the Grand Line. "But thanks for opening Mama's eyes," he finished softly with absolute sincerity and gratitude in his voice. At that, Luffy smiled brighter and shifted his gaze to Mama. "See, you aren't a shitty mother. If you were a shitty mother, you wouldn't have changed for the better, and everyone already forgave you." Big Mom looked towards her children who were agreeing with him too. Her eyes started to become watery at that. Not out of sadness, but out of relief and joy. She always wondered if she understood if some don't, but to think all of her children had forgiven her. She couldn't help but feel warm inside. The siblings looked worried seeing their mother in tears, but relaxed when they noticed she was smiling softly. Luffy looked at Big Mom, then at his siblings, then towards Mama. Then towards his siblings. Then towards Mama, then towards his siblings. He smiled, and anyone who looked towards their brother could almost see the light bulb lighting up above his head. He ran towards the back of the crowd of his siblings who all paid attention to him. Katakuri sighed while pinching his nose but looked amused seeing what he was going to do next. The siblings around noticed their elder brother sighing, but before they could ask why. Gomu no. They widened their eyes before looking behind them and paled. Luffy had his arms stretched and hanged onto the back of the bed frame behind Big Mom, who wiped her tears while looking curious on what her son was going to do. Before his siblings could protest or do anything about what he was going to do. Rocket. The siblings, along with their brother Luffy, were launched towards Big Mom, who, for the first time in her life, had a dumbfounded expression at seeing her children flying right at her. Quickly snapping out of her thoughts, she lowered and crossed her legs so her children could land in her lap. After landing into their mother's lap with some missing her entirely and slamming into either her pillow or the bed, Luffy just laughed while his siblings groaned while glaring at him lightly. Pudding, who landed next to him, huffed and pouted before pinching and stretching his cheek in annoyance over being launched towards Mama without warning. Some of the siblings who saw what Pudding mimicked her and started pinching and stretching his face to show they were clearly not amused by his actions. Luffy, with around 10 to 15 of his siblings stretching his face, started to smile sheepishly and started apologizing while scratching the back of his head, even though his grin shows no signs of being genuinely sorry. Big Mom, seeing her son getting pinched by her other children, couldn't help but giggle softly and quietly in amusement, which stunned her children. They have never heard her let out such an amused laugh before. Luffy, seeing her mother giggling, couldn't help but laugh along too. The siblings pinching him couldn't help but join in too, finding the situation funny. Then the rest of the siblings who were watching couldn't help but snicker a bit. Snickers and giggles slowly turned into full-blown laughter. Even Katakuri along with his stoic siblings couldn't help but laugh lightly or snicker a bit. Mama, throughout her laughter, couldn't help but feel internally warm and completed. Years of sad and depressive thoughts, gone in an instant thanks to her son. After the laughter died down, Big Mom looked down towards her children and smiled warmly and gently. Yeah, they were right. She changed for the better. Huh? It's already dinner time? Everyone was broken out of their thoughts and stared at a surprised Montdor who was looking at his pocket watch. Poire walked up to his side and squinted at the watch in his hands before going wide-eyed. He was right, it was already about time. Huh, time sure passes by, Poire commented. It felt like minutes went by, not hours. Big Mom motioned for her children to get off her lap, to which they did so their mother could get up from her bed. Wordlessly going towards the door, she swung it right open and turned around. She looked at her children with a soft and gentle look on her face and uttered two words that were filled with affection and love. Let's go, and her children responded as one with the same feeling as hers. Yes, Mama, but before they could leave for dinner. Nay. All of the Charlottes including Big Mom looked towards 11-year-old Wafers who stood timidly when all of her siblings and Mama's eyes were on her. What's wrong? Smoothie asked. About what Cracker Nee said earlier. The siblings tensed heavily while the mentioned sweet general froze in fear. What does shit mean? Wafers asked innocently while tilting her head in curiosity towards Cracker who looked like he was diagnosed by a doctor with an unknown lethal disease. The siblings froze before looking towards their mother who smiled. But they could see Conqueror's haki leaking out of her. They wisely backed away, with Poire hugging and moving a confused Luffy wrapped in her arms, and kept their distance from Cracker while offering a quick prayer. Now the question was, how bad was he going to get it from Mama? Second Sweet Commander and Minister of Biscuits, Charlotte Cracker. Ah. That bad. Why yes Mama? He replied sounding like a little bitch and they couldn't blame him. You have a 5-second head start, run. Yes Mama, Chapter 18. Dinner was very peaceful and quiet. But that was mainly because many of the siblings couldn't help but just stare silently at Cracker who was slumped on the table looking like a corpse. It was pretty awkward to eat their food while staring at their brother who kept opening and closing his mouth, but he was too quiet for most of them to hear what he was saying if he even was uttering sound at all. For those who were close enough to hear him muttering to himself however, they couldn't help but let a sweat drop at him. Never swear at the children. Never forget. Never swear at the children. Never forget. He had kept repeating that line like a broken snail recorder when Mama caught him and dragged him off to God knows where with Cracker desperately trying to get his grip onto the floor and screaming like never before while being dragged away. He had tried to run away, but he never had a chance to run away. Mama was playing around with him by giving him a glimpse of hope with a head start. But, you just can't outrun someone who can use Soru repeatedly. The fact that Mama also could be so fast and quick on her feet without Soru nor the help of Zeus carrying her was scary as hell. It was a terrifying sight to witness seeing their mother straight up teleport in front of him and started chasing him down, slowly walking like she was taking a stroll in the park before full-on sprinting at speeds only professional giant athletes could try and reach. It was like Admiral Kizaru snorted. White lines. Instead of smoking whatever kind of joint he is always high on and started talking at normal speed. Not to mention whatever punishment Mama dished out for him. Anyone on Whole Cake Island who could hear the screams of the poor sweet general shuddered and felt a chill going down their spine. Alright, Snack, where is the main base of operations of those S-bags? Oh, and do go over the events of today so far. Snack looked startled a bit before donning a serious look on his face. Although for the more observant siblings, they could see him take a quick glance at Cracker and shot him a look of pity before quickly looking back at Mama. Yes. We intercepted one of their ships which were led by the right-hand man of the organization. They were coming from around the southeast of Cheese Island and were planning to go from Cheese Island to Biscuit Island and they finally would try to invade Whole Cake Island and try to finish off or capture our weakened forces. Many of the siblings including Snack himself couldn't help but snort in amusement at that. As if sending weaklings after weaklings could weaken them or even make them tired. Babysitting their siblings when they were still toddlers were more of a challenge than them. After a conversation with our guests, Their main base of operation wasn't around the southern parts of Toto Land where they attacked from, but rather. They are further off west and slightly south from Daifuki Aniki's island. Snack then pulled out a Den Den Mushi projector, putting the map of the new world on the snail's left side, which made the snail glance at, which caused its right eye to project the map of the archipelago for all the siblings to see. Looking at the projected map, they focused on the red circle that centered around an island that was between Mogaro Kingdom and Toto Land, but it was more towards their archipelago rather than the kingdom. Did they spill about anything besides the location? What about their forces? Smoothie asked. Yes, they have stated how they are 300 men strong, and as for the big shots, they have, out of the 300, they have 10 people with 100 million berry on their heads. Besides that, the only person we should be cautious about is their captain with a bounty over 600 million berry on their head. At that, the siblings hummed in acknowledgement. Judging by the map and distance, it would take us about 3 days to get there, Lauren commented while leaning back into his seat while crossing his arms. Yeah, it should, Snack replied while shrugging. It's a pretty rough estimate. Big Mom hummed while getting her mind working on the next course of action. During these couple of months, the only thing they had to worry about were invasions by these organ-harvesting idiots. Besides that, there hadn't been much trouble that had been reported towards her, nor have her children seen or have received reports of anything truly troubling or problematic in the islands under them, only some minor. Only noteworthy reports personally to her and some of her children were some poor young brats that were either kicked off from their families, alone as their parents died, or runaways that escaped from their abusive parents and came here instead. Fortunately, they have an orphanage owned by Parasparrow in Candy Island where he properly educates and takes care of them alongside Compote, who loved kids, with Panna and Broy sometimes coming to the place to play with them. The others just stop by to check on their elder brother and sometimes entertain the orphans. The siblings with devil fruits use their abilities for tricks to amaze them. Besides that, the crime rate had decreased over time in the past 1.5 decades, with the homies, subordinates or her children roaming the streets and making sure the peace is maintained. She was confident that she could entrust her subordinates and maybe an increase of homies patrolling to make sure any shit doesn't stir while she and her children were gone for about maybe 2 or 3 days. Bobbin, Tamago and Peckhams were the major reasons as to why she was that confident. But they would be gone for 6 days, 3 to get there and 3 to come back, and that's not including the time it would take to destroy and wreak carnage on their base. If they travel by boat, that is 2 hours, it will take us 2 hours. At that, the siblings looked towards their mother, who looked quite confident over that statement. 2 hours to get there? Pudding asked innocently while tilting her head. No, 30 minutes to get there, an hour to slaughter them, and another 30 minutes to come back. The younger siblings were surprised but were curious as to how they would be able to get there in such a significantly short amount of time, while the older siblings knew what Mama was thinking about and looked towards her homie Zeus in childhood nostalgia. They remembered how they would fly high in the sky on him, and sometimes if they asked or when anyone wasn't looking, Zeus would travel at higher speeds to entertain them. It was fun as hell for some, a scary and terrifying moment for others. We are going to ride on Zeus and fly towards them, aren't we? Brûlée asked with excitement in her tone, which caused a couple of the older siblings to sweat drop at her, remembering their childhood. She was normally the one who excitedly asked Zeus to keep going faster and faster while laughing cheerfully in glee at the speed they were going at. Some of her siblings either cheered on or screamed and nearly pissed themselves over the fear of falling off from the ludicrous speeds Zeus was flying at. Broy would normally cling onto her and scream in terror with tears in her eyes, while Brûlée would scream in excitement with stars in her eyes when Zeus zoomed from island to island around Toto Land in less than an hour, sometimes taking a couple of minutes if he pushed his limits a bit. Zeus lit up at that while looking towards Mama, who nodded towards him, which caused him to beam. It's been a real long time since he could finally fly around with people riding him at fast speeds. Big Mom then looked back towards Brûlée and nodded. Yes, we are. We shall fly and hover above their base and drop down at their port first if they have one. Then we will make our way towards the other end of the island or their base while looking around and killing any pests. She was interested to see if there was anything noteworthy to steal from them. Be it devil fruits, new ingredients or whatever seemed interesting and caught either her or the children's eye. She wanted to make their way towards their base while either eliminating their forces or taking anything interesting. She was going to take everything they had and set an example on why it isn't a good idea to annoy them. We shall depart and leave 20 minutes from now. Bring whatever you need and let's thoroughly enjoy slaughtering them all. Yes, Mama. The children all stood up at once, with Cracker being assisted and guided by his sisters out of the room and left to prepare in their own ways. Luffy stood up while looking around, wondering what the hell he should do until Ewan patted him on the shoulder. Luffy hummed in curiosity and turned towards his brother who smiled at him. Ewan was interested to know more about Luffy about something. You don't got anything to do, right, you? Nope. Alright. Let's go and have a chat. Okay. Ewan turned and walked with Luffy trailing behind while they had a stupid smile or grin plastered onto their faces and went off. At Yen's room, the room itself was pretty big to accommodate for Yen's size and looked like any other normal room in an average house. They were sitting on the bed with Ewan and Luffy sitting on the opposite ends of the bed. Luffy crossed his legs looking at Ewan where Yunosuke had his back onto the wall and laid there. Ewan wanted to talk to Luffy because he needed to know something. Something that had been bothering him from listening to their brother telling tales of his adventures. He had picked up on something during Luffy's stories and that one conversation about his crew. It felt like there was always details that were left out when he talked. His crewmates, for example. It felt like there was an even bigger picture behind the backgrounds of his crewmates that he left out, but that wasn't the reason he dragged him. What he wanted to talk about was, Luffy, did you ever use haki before the Marineford fiasco went down you? How he never mentioned using haki during his journey. Not a single time has he heard him say anything about defeating people with armament haki nor any signs of using Conqueror's haki. Sure, he had never finished his story, but, from how he talked about fighting a fishman, from the execution attempt from Buggy, from the newspaper talking about how their brother stormed Eni's lobby and defeated a top government agent and the fact he fought and defeated warlord Gecko Moria, which they learned from Lola. All that, without haki? He could have defeated Arlong easily if he used haki and bashed him repeatedly until he was knocked out cold. He could have coated his neck in haki so Buggy couldn't decapitate him. He could have dealt with that Cypher Pole agent with ease with his armament and knock out most of the marine reinforcements with his conquerors. He could have gone toe-to-toe with Moria instead of relying on people. So why didn't he use haki? Not only that, but he was pretty sure he wasn't the only sibling who noticed how it felt like he skipped over a couple of details whenever he talked about either his journeys or about his crewmates. Luffy stared at Ewan for a sec before responding. Yeah, I did. At this, it intrigued Ewan. Who did you use haki on you? Crocodile? Ewan was shocked. He sometimes read the news after dinner while lying on his bed and had seen a particular headline that piqued his interest a few months back. Commodore Smoker defeats and arrests Warlord Crocodile. It didn't make sense for a Marine to go after a Warlord, even more so for a Commodore of all people to defeat Crocodile. After Crocodile's defeat, they looked into the Navy dog's background and history and found out he was originally stationed in Logatown as a captain. What a waste of resources to station someone like him in Logatown of all places. He clearly deserved a higher rank with his skills and power. He had potential to achieve more and should have been tasked with missions that accommodate for his strength. He doubted that his promotion would have existed if it wasn't for their brother's crew wreaking havoc around Paradise, causing the marine dog to chase them. But that was the Navy's problem, not theirs. But even so, he wasn't at the level to deal with someone like Crocodile, not yet anyway. That task was more suited for either an admiral or several vice admirals. He didn't know Luffy was their brother at the time, but if he had known, he would have connected the dots on how Crocodile was defeated when he noticed at the bottom of the headline mentioning the Straw Hats also coincidentally being at Arabasta too. But did he? Nay Luffy, did you know about this? Ewan stood up from his bed and bent over to grab a box underneath the bed. Opening the box, he rummaged through several issues of News-Ku newspaper that have piqued his interest and kept them to read when he got bored, before finding the one about Crocodile's defeat. Handing it to Luffy, he saw how his brother looked at the newspaper for a few seconds before going wide-eyed. Welp, that is 100% a look of a person that recently discovered something he should have known a long time ago. You didn't know you? No. But my bounty went up to 100 million after beating his ass. His face went from shocked to cheerful when talking about his bounty. At least his bounty still increased, and he still was gonna become the Pirate King. But I didn't really use it that often, Luffy added on. He only slightly used haki to either punch Crocodile a few feet back when he almost impaled him with his hook, but luckily he coated a part of his chest with armament underneath his vest in time, even though he still grabbed and slammed him into the sand and buried him. Or when Crocodile grabbed him by the neck and dehydrated him, but he was able to kick him in time before he was dehydrated to a near-death state, and also when he was finally defeating him, he sometimes threw a haki-coated punch that was mixed with blood-soaked arms. "Why not you?" Ewan asked. "It would have made things way easier if he did." "I made a promise to Shanks," Luffy said before lying down on the bed and looking up at the ceiling while remembering about the man. "What was it about?" Ewan asked, interested while not looking fazed by the mention of the Yonko. Tamago did mention how the Yonko had good relations with Luffy. "About how I should only really use haki if I fight someone super strong and make sure not a lot of people see it too. But when I reached the new world, I could go all out," Luffy said, grinning. He also saw it as a challenge when he taunted him about it too, saying he bet he needed to use haki all the time when fighting because he was weak without it, that damn tomato hair. "Is that so, Ewan said while tilting his head. Sounded like a challenge that was given to Luffy from the Yonko. It also would help make Luffy be seen less of a threat if the people who knew about his haki was kept at a minimum, which painted less of a target on him. Although that secret was blown out of the water with the broadcast of Marineford that fully displayed Luffy annihilating the three admirals. Honestly, he could fool anyone with how he looks like a kid before he absolutely destroys them in a fight, so that probably helped make him look less menacing too. Luffy hummed at that, which Ewan took as a yes. Looking around his brother's room, he saw his bounty poster on the left nailed on the wall with what seemed like previous bounties behind it too. Wanted dead or alive Charlotte Ewan 160,500,000. "Nay, how did you get your bounty?" Luffy asked while pointing towards Yen's bounty poster. "Ah, that was when Marines came to bring us to justice blah blah blah, sent us to impel down where we belong blah blah blah, and whatever crap they spewed you." He huffed when remembering about that day. "A bunch of Marine battleships led by several vice and rear admirals came around half a year ago to try and capture one of them for justice, or whatever kind of bullshit that came out of their mouths. Till this day, he is still baffled on why they haven't grabbed an admirtain. Their chances would go up if they bothered to bring one. Who the hell are the higher-ups that planned and orchestrated this was a question he has been waiting for an answer for. They kept rambling and rambling on, and it got really annoying before I got annoyed and attacked first. I moonwalked above them before absolutely annihilating a battleship with this Ewan said while proudly holding his staff that had an orb on its tip. The ball on this staff can expand to about the size of Opera Nissan and hits like a cannonball with a swing Ewan said enthusiastically before standing up and raising his staff above his head while Luffy just oohed in amazement. With my orb at its maximum size, I slammed it into the deck of the battleship with that annoying bastard and it exploded Ewan motioned his staff in a way that showed how he slammed it while Luffy just kept looking amazed. If anyone were to open the door to see what was going on inside, they would have probably immediately closed the door and walk away with a confused expression on their faces on what the fuck those two were doing. Ewan then laid back on the bed. And after that, the rest of us just absolutely massacred them afterwards. They were dumbasses for thinking they could take us on The only smart decision they made was retreating before the casualties increased even more. Overall, it was pretty good combat experience for me and the siblings around my age The Marines went from 300 men strong, which included 3 rear admirals and 6 vice admirals and several seamen and officers of various ranks, to a crippling casualty of 97 dead, 80 wounded, 67 crippled for life, and 56 captured to be either tortured, interrogated or a generous donation towards Mama's soul supply. Unfortunately, no dead vice nor rear admirals for the Charlottes, but they finally realized that retreating was better than fighting a losing battle. On their side were numerous replaceable chess homies consisting of 150 pawns, 75 bishops, 75 knights and 50 rooks. The younger siblings partaking in this battle were Ewan, Raisin, Joconde, Mascarpone and Joscarpone, who were followed by their older and more experienced siblings, Mont d'Or, Galette, Poire, Melisse, Saint Marc, Bascarte, Cinnamon, High Fat, Mozart, mash, and just in case they needed more backup, brulee. The only one wounded was Raisin, but that was because he let his guard down against a vice admiral when a rear admiral came up behind and attacked him. Left a bit of a scar when he turned towards the bastard and took the slash to his chest, but nothing terrible. To the Marines it was a fight for justice. For them, it was pretty good combat exercise and helped them give ideas on what to improve on. Ewan smiled in nostalgia over the moment the Marines realized they fucked up big time messing with them. Glancing at the clock, he stood up and walked towards the door. "Alright, it's time let's go." Luffy nodded and followed behind him. Yeah, now, he can't wait to see the terror and horror plastered on those damn organ harvesters next when they drop down on them. At the rooftop of Whole Cake Castle, Katakuri, along with Daifuki, Oven, Perispero, Compote and Hachi were already present 5 minutes earlier. The sweet commander stood tall, with a pouch of beans and a little time with himself and his beloved donuts. He was ready. Taking a glance towards a table surrounded with the other 5 siblings with him, Compote, Perispero and Daifuki were enjoying tea while Hachi and Oven had a cup of coffee with them. He looked towards the entrance towards the rooftop and was guessing when they would come here. Hachi's other sisters, Amand, Mundi and Effeler, prefer to come on time. Knowing Brule and Broy, Brule would come earlier than Broy, probably excited with the aspect of riding on Zeus again and probably would try and get him to fly at extreme speeds. Even though she is in her 40s, she could be childish at times. While Broy was probably trying to mentally prepare herself, she wasn't one that could handle moving on a fast-moving vehicle, or in this case, homie after all. Cracker would be interesting to guess. He wondered when he would come around and recover from whatever Mama did to him. He most likely would come with his triplet sisters because they were snapping him out of it. The quintuplets would come without Opera. The man himself would probably be busy reading a comic book again, and by the time he realized it was time, he would arrive around 1 to 5 minutes later than the agreed time. Depends on how fast he runs and panics. He could guess accurately what time, what activities or shenanigans his siblings around his age are up to. The younger ones though are pretty hard to read considering he doesn't really interact with them. He was too busy playing the part of a dependable, strong, perfect brother. Although, he was interested in wondering what Ewan and Luffy were talking about. It's pretty rare for Ewan to bring someone into his room for a chat. Normally he preferred talking to them on the spot. Must have been really important if he wanted a more private location to converse whatever subject he was interested on with Luffy. After some time passed, he accurately guessed that Brule came looking quite positive and energetic, like a kid finally getting a chance to ride a roller coaster, while Broy followed behind looking slumped. Even with the 20 minutes to prepare herself, she did not look prepared to ride on Zeus. It was now time. Amand, Mundi and Effeler, Ewan and Luffy along with most of the other siblings started coming in with Mama following behind. Big Mom stood at the front of the group while looking like she was doing a head count. After a few seconds passed, Cracker with his sisters finally came, although they could see a red handprint on the sweet commander's face which raised some eyebrows. The giant woman made sure to count the triplets before thinking. Where's your brother, Opera? She asked while looking at the present quintuplets. Ah, he's busy reading that comic book of his, Gala said while stroking his beard while the 3 other brothers nodded alongside him. Galette, Mont d'Or, and those close to the minister facepalmed. Of course he was busy with something unimportant. And you didn't bother telling him it was about time? She raised an eyebrow over them which caused them to look sheepish. To be fair, he told us not to disturb him and he promised to be a few seconds late, Cadenza said, helpfully, although it was now longer than a mere few seconds. Big Mom was about to say something before the men himself came busting through the doors looking a bit panicked. I was busy FA. Just join with your other siblings. Yes Mama, and with that, everyone was present. Alright, Zeus. Expand. Yes Mama. The mentioned homie nodded and expanded to the size of the rooftop and stationed besides the rooftop. Big Mom was the first to step on Zeus before being followed by the others. As soon as everyone got on board of Zeus, the cloud homie immediately departed. Big Mom turned towards her children with a sweet sinister grin. Alright, listen up. We will drop down on them and as soon as we land, take out anyone who are not your siblings. We will start from their port or beaches and make our way towards the other end of the island. Make sure the last moments of their lives are filled with terror and horror. Yes Mama. Like a student towards a teacher, Hannah raised her hand, which Mama took notice of. Yes, dear? What will this operation be called? At that Big Mom was thinking. They were seen as devils and monsters. Sometimes the females of the family were called witches, most prominent being Melisse and Brûlé. And they were attacking them at night. They will be raining down, bringing pain and death towards them. Racking her brain, she looked at her children before she lit up. We shall call this operation